الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم علمنا بما ينفعنا وينفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. I don't know if there's feedback. Can you still hear me? Feedback okay? That's fine. All right. If you're okay, I'm okay. Inshallah. Bismillah. So, okay. So inshallah ta'ala, I'd like to spend my time today sharing some methodologies from working groups that I've been involved with. Taking off from the standpoint, actually you heard this morning, Dr. Ullis talking about transdisciplinary work. I gave a shout out yesterday that there is some real deep thinking we have to do in AI ethics about whether it's transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or not. And I'm going to share with you, and hopefully a conversation about how to put together working groups to address this question, right? To address problematic issues that reside between the interfaces of many different fields. So as I began yesterday, I was sort of saying that there's a problem space. We have to do conceptualization, right? Tasweer of what's happening from different perspectives to get a better understanding of how to then generate solutions. So the past, or the first step, is understanding the problem space. Then the second step is to create a solution space, which often involves different disciplines coming together. So I'm going to push us to think about from moving description, which is what is the remit often of Islamic studies, right? Islamic studies proper is description, to intervention, which might be the remit of scientists, right? Who think about intervening, or policy wonks who think about intervening through policies. So to that end, and Dr. Amina will tell me whether I'm talking about multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, but I wanted to again start off with this idea that we have to make a decision in AI ethics what we believe is the way to solutions, right? And you start off, however, with a multidisciplinary identification of the problem space. So you start off multidisciplinary, whether the solution resides in either of these spectrums is open for an open debate, and people can have different views on that. So the first part of my talk will be about one working group on theology and science, the second about Islam and biomedicine, and third about enhancing life studies. So again, I try to start off with all of the points, the summary points at the beginning. So here's my summary points of why we need a working group strategy and what it looked like in the work that I've been involved with. So the goals and the methods. So one goal of multidisciplinary work is to bridge knowledge gaps, right? So all of us are trained in specific disciplines. Perhaps you're literate in others. And if we're really lucky, we're expert in multiple. But we have to bridge knowledge gaps that we have, right? Because we will not know something fully about sociology or about public policy or about even the data science structures behind AI coding. So we want to bridge knowledge gaps. And the method to do that is and what we employed is scholarly retreats, right? With a closed group of individuals. And the first part of that is to develop a shared vocabulary, a conceptual vocabulary, a lexicon through which you can now have a conversation. We often neglect that because we think that people speak the same language. I mean by the disciplinary language, well, we don't, right? So when a physician says, I have a specific vocabulary around, and I'll show you the risk, it means something different to an individual who's sitting in financial sector. Risk means something else. I use different methods to understand and identify risk. They use different methods to understand risk. Maybe we speak a similar language, but we have a different conceptual framework of that situated in our field. When we say harm, right, the Islamic jurist might think of harm differently than someone who's thinking about public policy. And you might use the same language and the same term, but there's a whole host of ideas that might not be shared. So you begin with this idea of trying to develop a shared lexicon, particularly for the aim, as I said, to begin with identifying the multiple dimensions of the problem space, right? So what is the dimension that is social? What's the dimension that is scientific, so to speak, right? What is the natural science issue here? What is the religious issue here? So you want to develop this vocabulary so then you can have a passageway for conversation between the multiple dimensions of the ethical problem space. Okay, the second real issue for the need for working groups is to facilitate cross-disciplinary dialogue and co-learning, right? And you do that, or what we did that by having pre-reading that was collated collectively. So prior to retreats, you would have 10 papers or several chapters from a book that we'd collate together, meaning individuals in these working groups would say, okay, what is it that you think you need to communicate to us, other groups, right? And you would collate a reading list together that we'd have to prepare and think about before we're coming. And then the other idea is to produce new knowledge. So I started off the talk, and the title of the talk is producing knowledge, right? We're in the game of producing new knowledge. That's what the academy is for, right? We want to produce new knowledge, not just recycle old things or old ideas. And to do that, we want to not present new knowledge, but intersectional knowledge between different disciplines, right? To do that, we would have writing assignments. So this is really, I'm just being very prescriptive here, that after you have a retreat where you talk about certain things, you've read things before, now you must start producing knowledge. And the first start to do that is to start writing, right? Allama bil qalam, right? We have to learn by writing. So you have to write something. So, and to get your thoughts down on paper, it is not sufficient. Today we have what I would say, the democratization of knowledge has led to a lot of speaking heads, and that's one thing. But to actually break down and write something, right, and make it understandable to others is a different. So that task is important. And then the last thing is to engage multiple, because we're looking at the multiple dimensions of a problem, right? So now you have to engage with those multiple different audiences and stakeholders, community, whether they be community, public, or academic. So to address that, we want to engage them in dialogue, right, and reflexive dialogue, and to think about whether the work that we're producing, a potential solution, how would it look like, what would it look like, is this a possible one? We co-produce, meaning the scientists, so to speak, right, and the scholars of the text, so to speak, would come together and co-produce community and academic presentations and publications. So we initially thought, and I'll show you that we could do this alone, but the idea was to generate knowledge together. So we would be able to present in front of these multiple audiences. So this is the so-called money slide. I'll explain to you through these three projects how that looked like. It's slightly different in each one of them. So the first working group was on scientific discoveries and theological realities, right? That's a nice, very high-minded title. But really, the question underlying that was this: how might we integrate scientific data and ways of knowing with Islamic moral and theological frameworks? That was the overarching question, which was then led to two research questions, right? So these were the research questions that we framed, and this is work that we did, as you can see here now, developing a vocabulary. What does risk mean, and how is it ascertained and calculated? Simple question, perhaps, right? So that was a framing question, because we want to understand, when you're talking about science and theology, how do you think about risk in those disciplines, wherever they come from? And then the second question was, what is the soul, and how its capacity is manifested bodily, right? So we went from moral theology to what we say scholastic theology, right? Went from sort of, you can say, kalam in the second stage, and the first stage we were talking about usul fiqh, right? So how do we think about these sorts of things in different registers? All right, so to do that, the first working group involved people, I'd say experts with bridging knowledge. And bridging meaning that they would have a foot in a scientific field and a foot, or at least literacy in the Islamic sciences or one particular branch of Islamic sciences. So let me share with you who these individuals were and where they came from. So we have theologians, right? So Sheikh Amin Khalwadi, one of my teachers from Dar al-Qasim, and Sheikh Jihad Brown, formerly of Taba, now he's at Bayan Institute in Chicago, from different ilks in the tradition themselves, right? Ashari one, Maturidi the other, one's Hanafi. So they're different sort of dynamics, different ones studied in different places, coming together representing different parts of the tradition. But they were theologians. They had, Sheikh Jihad done a master's at Cambridge, right? So he had both academic and seminary training. Islamic studies, so this is where we talk about the hybridicity of the scholars, right? And alhamdulillah, you're lucky if you have people who have this hybridicity to come together. So Omar Quraishi, a very close friend of mine now, is the provost at Zaytuna College with Sheikh Hamza. He used to be a science teacher. And then, mashallah, he did he studied abroad in Syria and other places, got a ijazah in various Islamic sciences. He did a PhD in Chicago in educational philosophy. And then, as I said, now is the provost at Zaytuna College. So had a spectrum of hybridicity and interdisciplinary work himself. Sheikh Ustad Taha al-Basir, a very close friend of mine, he is a prominent figure in Islamic finance, right? We're talking about risk. So he's a deputy of Sheikh Nizam Yaqubi, and he leads Straightway Ethical Advisory. He did a PhD, didn't quite finish his PhD at Harvard. Nonetheless, he was a chaplain, so had multiple sort of disciplines within himself, and has traditional science ijazahs. And then Sheikh Muhammad Volkan Sudalski, also a faculty member at Dar al-Qasim, who did a PhD in Hanafi, the history of Hanafi school at University of Chicago, but then also had Islamic studies expertise, seminary-wise, from various places, Turkey and otherwise. So again, this sort of Islamic studies paradigm, but individuals who had one foot in a analytic science, let's say, and in a theological science. And then we had, because it was, I'm a physician, so we had people from the medical sciences who were talking about risk, and we were talking about the soul. So Faisal Qazi, a friend of mine from neuroscience background, Trinka Klima, who was a fellow of mine in ethics, but also is a doctor in nursing practices. And then Ahsan Rozullah, a colleague who had a background in epidemiology, was also a physician. So as you see here, we have theologians, Islamic studies, and then medical practices talking about science and theology, and specifically selected. So this was people, as I had invited a lot of different people, but we had to add, as I said, some hybridicity in the way you think about the tradition, as well as the scientific field that you're in. So what did this look like? Investing to produce knowledge, and this is the investment I think that it takes. This, by the way, this was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Not that type of investment, although that's important as well. This type of investment. So over 2 years, we met 6 times for 2 days, right? A weekend retreats, spaced between, because we had pre-work to do and post-work to do. So about 90 hours of FaceTime together in closed rooms, right? We're lucky we survived each other's company. But we spent a lot of time beyond what was pre-reading and post-reading. Then, so that's the work that does to be able to then produce knowledge. And then you want to show and disseminate that knowledge. So we had presentations at each retreat that we decide together, collaboratively, co-learning, who's presenting what, because we didn't understand what you said before, or we need a better understanding of this theory or that theory or whatever else it might be. And so there'd be interval research that occurs. Then we led to dissemination of academic presentations, and they had to be academic. So create abstracts that will be accepted at a meeting. If it's not accepted, revise your abstract, present at a different meeting. Like, you have to meet the bar for the academic register. This is not just some, just exercise in sort of nicety. It's not a feel-good exercise. And we did get rejections, which is appropriate. So that means you have work to do. And that led to the manuscript writing, right? After abstracts, obviously, then you have to present papers. Same thing. You're going to write a manuscript. It has to be accepted by an independent, peer-reviewed journal. If it's not, too bad. Go back to the drawing board, right? Because your ideas were not good enough to meet the bar, to engage with the world today. That's the point, right? We can feel good when we talk to each other. We can give a lot of talks. But unless the outside world is going to read our stuff and think it's valuable, then it's just a feel-good activity. So the dissemination then, as I mentioned, led to academic presentations at various conferences, but we also wanted to engage with the professional and public audiences at the Islamic Society North America meeting, or ICNA, Islamic Circle North America, and bioethics workshops. And then we held our own conference at the University of Chicago, where the Initiative of Islamic Medicine was rooted for many years, which I led, that brought these things together in a certain way to have a conversation with interlocutors. So these two individuals, right, there were some people, as you can see here, who are not part of the working group, who were really interlocutors with us and thinking about, okay, well, those ideas, these papers, what I mean. So give you a sense of what I mean about producing knowledge and doing it together. So we talked about, Islamic ontological schema of healing, but you see there are multiple authors from different backgrounds coming together, right? Sheikh Omar and I have a very good, mashallah, relationship. We did some work on healthcare seeking. And then again, we're talking about the mind-body problem, physiological discourse, something I know very little about, but I got to learn a little bit about moving forward through conversations at the working groups. So that's the first, right? So this iteration, 2 years or so. Then the second working group had to do with, we learned a lot of things. I can share with you what we learned, what didn't work or what did work. But the second working group had to do with a different question, slightly more, I would say, further removed from these issues of the soul. We just wanted to have a better question of how might scientific knowledge inform and work with various Muslim theologies of nature and being and life, right? So moving higher up than just sort of thinking about risk. And then generally speaking, what are the relationships between Islam and biomedicine, right? So I mean, this particular thing about biomedicine, we can talk about in the Q&A. And here it's changed the dynamic because of the things that we learned. So it was extremely at times difficult for individuals to think about things outside of their silos. So we said, okay, we'll get a different group of people and you'll work in your silo. You want to become the Padela, you want to think about your discipline and you want to do your own research and you don't want to kind of engage as much, fine, go ahead. So we said we're going to let you do your pre-work and present a paper. That's the first thing. Present a paper about these questions from whatever work you want to do, because academicians are used to doing things by themselves. So fine. So they presented their papers at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, right, to peers and to an audience. Then after you've done your homework and you've presented your paper, we're going to have a close over to you where we're going to critique it together, right? What didn't make sense? Why is this problematic? Why your citations don't work? What ideas can be improved in a small group fashion? And with knowledge cafes and retreats, we're going to actually have people who are interlocutors that you have to speak to and communicate that are not from your field. So you're comfortable with Islamic studies, but now we're going to have someone from history, intellectual historian, and engage with you and make sure that your ideas make sense to them, because the work isn't for your field, it's for generating a different field. So you have to be able to communicate. So we did that, and that led to a symposium, and then again, where we presented these papers in final form in an edited volume, inshallah. So here, as I said, the different group of people, right? Some similar, but there was not this notion of hybridicity. We said, do your own work, apply to be part of this group. We invited some people, but you would see like, I mean, Shabana is from Islamic Studies in Qatar, right? That's what he does. He spends time in different areas. Sheikh Aasim Yusuf is a friend of mine. He's hybrid, so we'll leave him aside, but he's a psychiatrist and Islamic Studies teacher. But Omar Quraishi in the back, Abdul Aziz Sachidina, Dr. Fifi Al-Kiti, Sheikh Fakhat Rashid, myself, and Ahmed Raghab, intellectual historian, Professor Murray, Professor Porman, and Mehrunisa. But again, here there was some notion of hybridicity, that you're using Islamic studies or your field to talk about another area, but not that you've had to have this within yourself. So this experiment led to this. This is the book, inshallah, will come out shortly. But what I want to talk about, there's a different benefit here, right? So we spent a lot of time on history and medieval ideas, and so we had intellectual historians to help us think about these things in a very in-depth way. So the book starts off with, and the symposium starts with the history, intellectual history of engagement with Islam and medicine. Then epistemology, we spent a lot of time about epistemology. Then we can talk about medical praxis, right? So if you don't know the history of ideas, then you can't think about the way or how to engage those ideas in modernity, you certainly can't talk about medical practice. And so this was staged conversations through our retreat, and people were brought here together to have that conversation. And then, of course, we have to begin and end with Ghazali, right? Imam Ghazali, the great Hujjat al-Islam there, who Dr. Fifi, I spent a lot of time on. So I'm going to share with you the slides I presented, or just two slides with less of the commentary of why this is sort of important and how it's related to working group methodology. So if you think about some state, and obviously this is medicine, right? So we're thinking about healthcare delivery, that's what it stands for. Some state of something happening in the world, and you have an Islamic scholar wanting to think about that, right? What's going on here? What should be better? I mentioned to you yesterday that we have to think about it in different ways. So you have a subject of knowledge, a subject looking at an object of knowledge, right? So the subject wants to think about the object. What's happening is that you need to build a bridge of knowledge, right? Between the reality on the ground and the individual who wants to understand the reality. And therefore, the individual, right, the subject who wants to gain knowledge has to use many tools of reflection. And what ends up happening is, as you use each tool of reflection, the object is disclosed progressively. It undergoes processes of disclosure. So what I mean by that is that we are constructing knowledge in a social sphere. So let's make a clearer example, right? Make it very practical. There is a social dimension to healthcare delivery, right? There's a scientific, meaning biological methodology of healthcare delivery. There's a policy of relevance to health delivery, right? There's an emotional context of healthcare delivery. And so the human being needs to use all those faculties to understand what's happening in healthcare. So you need to have all those tools of reflection. How do I understand the sociology of what's happening? How do I understand the history of what's happening? How do I understand the policy level of what's happening? How do I understand actually the medical issues that are happening? All of those things. Otherwise, you should keep quiet. Because then you only have partial knowledge, right? This is what I was saying. So to understand the situation, the ethical problem space, to generate solutions, you have to have all of these things come together. And certainly, there's a social coefficient of knowledge. I mean, all of this is happening in society. It is embodied, right? Or it is in practices. So you have to understand that. So what really is important, oftentimes neglected, is the symbols, structures, and rituals, right? This is what conveys what that thing means to us. That's the meaning-making activity. The symbols, the structures, and rituals. Think about that with Islam itself, right? the symbols of Islam, the structures of Islam, and the rituals of Islam. These give us meaning, and they then inform action. So we're moving from descriptive research to action-oriented interventional research. You have to understand the social instantiation of these ideas, right? So now, once you've done, that's description. So we've described the problem space. Then you want to move to intervention from an Islamic perspective. Again, you have, the Islamic scholar. He's going to generate Islamic moral knowledge about the issue in two registers, right? So he's going to, the way, or he or she, let's say, right, is going to use sort of this idea of husuli knowledge, right? The huduri knowledge, I want to think about what, as our colleague was saying, maqasid, what does Islam want for us in this area of healthcare, for example, or policy making, for example, right? And I'm going to think about that ideal state, because now I know what the state is in, firstly, what's happening today, but now I'm thinking about what it should look like, using my scriptural understandings, right? Hikmah, illah, all these things we can talk about. And so again, I have to understand, as a sitting for the scholar, that my knowledge of what it is just perceptive knowledge, right? It's idrak of what? What that thing really is, I don't know. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. What that state really looks like, I don't know. But there's some semblance I have in the description. And in the intervention, I have to think about the ideal counter world I want to bring about. Do I know how to bring about it myself? Perhaps not. But at least I can think about what that should look like and then engage others to do that. Now, on the other side, this object of knowledge, right? I mentioned is undergoing process of disclosure. To have a better sense of what that might look like or how it can be brought about, you certainly need what I would say here, scripturally analyzed husuli knowledge. Because the scholar might not have an understanding how to create those policies to bring that about. And whether the policy that you're suggesting is actually going to have alternate ramifications, which requires this methodology of first thick description, then multifaceted solutions. And you have to bring both scripture and science together. Now, that's the point, right? That we have to understand things to the social existence in the world. Okay, the last project, where I was not a PI, but I was invited to be a scholar amongst that, was Enhancing Life project. So it addressed two big questions. What does it mean to enhance life, especially spiritual life? And then what are the spiritual laws, right, for the strategies, social mechanisms, and technologies that enable us to enhance life? Once we figure out what life and how enhancing life looks like, how can we bring that about in this world? That's the point, right? And it's many dimensions. So again, what state do we want? How do we bring it about using a multidisciplinary focus? So this involved and moved beyond Islam, right? So it involved multi-faith and multidisciplinary scholars, 33 scholars from around the world, different contexts. And now this is sort of an embellishment. Okay, we're going to have more intensive retreats, right, with didactic interlocutors. So instead of like 6 weekends and for 2 years or whatever else, now we're talking about 10 days. You sit together in the morning, you do your own research. In the afternoon, present what you learned. Let's have a conversation. Let's have didactics. So it's really intense bringing together of individuals. And then we led to not a 2-day, not a 1-day symposium, a 5-day capstone conference with interlocutors who would come in, right, from different disciplines to make sure that your work is relevant to them, right, these different stakeholder groups. And then once you generate this knowledge, we have to apply it. So many people are teachers, right, academicians. So now teach, as shared with Dr. Junaid the other day, that we taught 60 courses, right? You're mandated to teach courses twice around this idea of enhancing life with different audiences and different ways. So you now have seeded curricula across the globe in this area, right? And piloted it. And then we put the syllabuses online for other scholars to take and bring it to their own institutions. So the key points again, right, to producing new knowledge requires that you bridge concepts, right? And you bring about a shared vocabulary with a multidisciplinary group, right? That you have to have intensive co-learning from each other with epistemic humility. Recognize what the first key to knowledge understanding is: know what you don't know. You have to learn what you don't know. Not, I'm going to share with you what I know. I'm going to tell you and I'm going to learn for myself what I don't know. So then I can engage with you. And then multidisciplinary investigation and solutions building. Again, you saw I didn't put the word there. What type of solution you want to generate? Interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or transdisciplinary, that's up to you and the problem space that you're working with. And then lastly, right, you have to engage multiple stakeholder audiences to refine, revise, understanding, and solution ideas. It's about changing the world. It's not just about writing some article that gets cited maybe 10 times and you feel good about yourself. So you have to engage with the structures in which you want to change things, right? Whether they be political structures, whether they be educational structures, whether they be other structures, right? Healthcare structures, for example. And they will help say, okay, your solution makes no sense, it won't work here, period. Nice work, go back to the drawing board. And you have to engage with the world that is at. So the last thing I'll say, and what I tried to present, and I appreciate the invitation to present this, is that you have to have a patterned, systematic mode of dialogue, deliberation, interaction. At the Aasim, this is design. We were talking about design last night, and you have to design this to lead to the outcomes. Poor design, you don't get the outcomes. And so this was strategic over, now this is like, I'm telling you, 10 years of work of thinking about working groups and how to bring them together, inshallah ta'ala. So with that, I will leave you to think about what that looks like and where that is. That's Qatar. Jazakallah khair.